The Conquer Worry Show, episode number 20. Welcome to the Conquer Worry Show, the show dedicated to helping people who struggle with their minds. If you are looking for stories of resilience, if you are looking for inspiration, or you simply want to conquer worry, this is the show for you.
Welcome to another episode of the Conquer Worry Show. I am your host, Jay Coulter, and I'm excited to have Dan Lukasik on this episode of the show. Dan is a managing partner at the law firm Bernardi Lukasik, based in Buffalo, New York. He is listed in the publications The Best Lawyers in America, Super Lawyers, and the Buffalo Law's Journal's Who's Who in Law. In 2008, Dan created LawyersWithDepression.com, the first website and blog of its kind in the country to help law students, lawyers, and judges cope with and heal from depression. The site and Dan's work have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Law, and several other national and international publications. He is also the executive producer of the documentary A Terrible Melancholy, Depression in the Legal Profession. Currently, he's working on a book about depression and lawyers. So, Dan, are you ready to help some folks conquer worry?
I sure am. Thanks for having me on, Jay.
Of course, Dan. We are honored that you've come on the show. You're doing fantastic work in the legal community, and we really think this episode will help some of our listeners. So first, we'd like to get to know a little bit about you. And specifically, we're interested in things that listeners couldn't find out about you with a simple Google search. So take a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I grew up about 25 miles outside of Buffalo, New York, in a place called Lockport, which is famous for its locks that go up and down for shipping traffic. And I grew up in a rural area outside the city. My mom and my dad were World War II generation people. My dad served in the Navy in the Philippines and saw a lot of battles. Came back, married his sweetheart, and over time developed PTSD and became a very, very severe alcoholic. He died from it when he was 56 or over 30 years ago. And I think the other thing that I think is significant as far as my roots is I come from a blue-collar, working-class family. All four of my grandparents emigrated from Poland, working in factories when they got here. So I really learned the value growing up of hard work and that the dignity of hard work and that how hard it is to make a living. And all the people I represent at my firm are working people.
56. That's awful young for your father to pass away.
Yeah, he had cirrhosis of the liver, and throughout my childhood, there were five of us, was a very violent, abusive man who became consumed by his drinking, his PTSD, and I'm sure if he were alive today would be diagnosed either with depression or bipolar disorder. He was a tormented person, you know.
I'm sure. So, Dan, we like to bookend our shows with our flagship questions, and we're going to talk about finding your purpose in life later. But right now, let's talk about worry. And in 1 to 2 sentences, could you tell us a little bit about how you personally conquer worry?
2 ways, I think, for me. Mindfulness meditation, which is something I do every single day for about 20 minutes. And the second way for me is meaning making, which is doing things every day that are meaningful to me, personally meaningful.
Meaningful making and meditation. I like it.
Yes.
That is a defined plan for conquering worry.
For me, every day.
I like it. There's definitely a lesson there for our listeners. So everyone has struggled with worry at some point in their life. For some folks, it's been a major mental illness like you and I have struggled with, and for others, it's something less harsh. Take us to a low point in your life and tell us the story, where you are, what you're going through.
Well, I'm 53 now, and depression really first struck hardcore when I turned 40, or about 13 years ago. I was the managing partner of my firm and trying cases all across New York State. I had a lot of responsibility on me, and I'd always been a very anxious, kind of stressed person. I wasn't very good at stress management, but I was always able to overcome it, in different kinds of ways. And it seemed to get worse as I approached 40. I wasn't as effective as managing it as before. And what happened was it seemed as though the apple cart tipped over from anxiety to depression. And at first I didn't understand that. I thought it was more burnout, but the symptoms got worse. I began to, the first part that was the worst was my sleep. It became very fragmented and disjointed. I would be very tired and go to bed early, but I'd wake up, 3 in the morning wide awake. I'd want to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. And I'd shower and shave at 3 in the morning and drive to an all-night coffee shop and just sit there with maybe a day-old paper and doodle and wait for the sun to come up, and then I would drive to work. And it was, at first I didn't know what, I didn't tell anybody. I became very worried, and then the wheels started to come off. I couldn't concentrate. I was becoming less productive. I was trying to hide that this was going on. And I remember distinctly driving home in the dark in the wintertime and pulling into my street and sitting in my truck in the driveway when it was dark, and I was listening to National Public Radio, and they had this show called Fresh Air with Terry Gross. And it was a great interview. I forget who it was, but at the end they said, we have this compilation of our best interviews, and it's called Driveway Moments. So it's the kind of thing that made you stop in your driveway and just keep listening before, even when you want to go in the house, just kept listening. And, I thought of my driveway moments, and the deep, deep pain I was in were my driveway moments, and the terror of walking through the door and seeing my family, my wife and children, all happy to see me, and having to hide, the horror I was living through at the time was just very, very difficult, very, very difficult for me. And I was ultimately diagnosed with major depression, sent to a psychiatrist, and that was the very beginning. That was 12 years ago now of my journey through this.
Dan, you articulated that so well. I mean, I was sitting there in the driveway with you, and anybody who has struggled can probably think back to that point in time for themselves. Now, tell us, how did you mentally get yourself out of that hole?
Well, I think that, when we think about it, I think really it's a series, at least for me. I mean, a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about depression, one of which, of course, is, you take a pill like you take a pill for diabetes, and it controls it. Most people that I know have chronic depression, meaning it goes, they have maybe a major episode, and then it goes on through their life, sometimes better, sometimes worse. But these are people who've listened to the advice, get help. They've gotten help. They get that, and they're either getting help or they're in and out of help. They're like depression veterans. That's what I like to call them. Okay, they're in it for the long haul,
Yeah.
And I think that that's really what happens to many people, and those are the kind of people I deal with the most.
Mm-hmm. So, how did you find that you got yourself out of that hole when you were?
Sure. Well, I think the first step was definitely medication for me, because as long as these, your brain is out of balance, chronic fatigue, you're tired all the time, you can't concentrate, there's no way you're going to be able to benefit from the insights or the wisdom you learn in therapy. You can't apply it to your life because you can't think clearly. So the first step, I think, for me was getting those somatic, painful physical symptoms to calm down. And that was effective for me. And as they began to calm down, I began to get healthier through therapy and learning better life skills, I guess, that I had never learned in my life to try to get better, overcome depression, and lead a healthier life. So I think it was the 1-2, the medication and then the therapy. And a lot of the research shows that it's the two things that are most effective in helping people get out of depression.
Yeah, so definitely the first step was to seek some professional help and then kind of even the playing field by getting on some medication so you could start the process of getting better, if I understand you.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. Yes.
Excellent. So the statistics about depression in the legal community are absolutely mind-blowing. Research out of the University of Arizona, Dan, finds that 20% of lawyers struggle with depression at any given time. That's 1 in 5, twice the national average. Research out of the University of Washington finds that 40% of law students, 40%, have suffered with depression by the time they graduate. Why is depression so significantly higher in the legal community?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think before I comment on that, I think those statistics, I think what would be interesting, and I often say this when I talk to people, is to put them in perspective, to show the magnitude of them. 20% of lawyers suffer from depression. There's 1.2 million lawyers in America today. That means 240,000 lawyers right now as we talk are struggling with depression. It's just a whopping number. It's double the national average. 40% of law students, they did a study in which they tested law students before they came into law school, and they were right about the national average for depression, or about 10%. So 10% of those people would have some kind of issue before they began. By the end of the first year, it had risen to 20%, and by the end of the second year, it had risen to 40%. There's 150,000 law students in America. So when you plug in the 40%, you're looking at 65,000 law students in America that at some point will have an issue with depression in their 3 years at school. It's just an enormous number. And I think some of the reasons why law students have depression are a little bit different than why lawyers have depression.
Well, tell us about that.
Sure. Well, I think that since I'm many years removed from law school, I'll talk about that one first. Why do lawyers have so much depression? I think some of it is, and this connects to what, we can talk about worry and anxiety, is that I think the current research, neuroscience, is pretty clear that there's a powerful connection between stress, anxiety, and depression. I think it's 60% of people with depression also have a concurrent anxiety disorder and vice versa. So they usually travel together because they're mood disorders. They emanate from the midbrain of the limbic system, that part of the brain which controls our emotions. So that seems to be, we know that that's true. And as time goes on for lawyers, it's an adversarial profession. As time goes on, they get worn down. And I think what happens is they go from stress to chronic stress to anxiety to depression. And that's true more so than the average person, because I think at the heart of it is the adversarial nature of it. And I think that there's this wonderful book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Professor Sapolsky out at the Stanford University. And what he says is fascinating, because what he says is, listen, our bodies are the same they were 20,000 years ago. We're still engineered the same way by our genetics. We're basically built to respond to trouble in our environment with fight or flight. That's it. So when our ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, were being chased by a tiger or another caveman, they'd either fight with their clubs or they'd run away. okay? But the stress or the trouble was very short term. It's very short-term stress, and our bodies can handle that. Today, it isn't short-term stress. It's chronic, perpetual stress. Chronic. So our nervous systems were never designed for that kind of stress load. They weren't designed for it. So instead of burst of responses, we have to respond all day long. And they now know that what happens with people with too much anxiety and depression, their cortisol level is way too high. Chronic stress dumps a lot of cortisol into our bodies, affects the hippocampus and the amygdala, which are connected to mood disorders, anxiety, and depression. And it becomes impossible for people to shut it down. They almost have like a broken thermostat. They get less and less able to manage their stress, anxiety, and depression. And that's why things often get worse for them unless they get some kind of help.
And I assume that extrapolates back to law school with the high pressure of year one and year two. Yeah.
Correct. And maybe there's another part of it with law school. I think a lot of the research shows that beginning in law school, there's a particular kind of thinking, or we like to say, our first year, we hear this all the time in law school, learning to think like a lawyer. You're going to be taught to think like a lawyer. And predominantly, and there's a guy named Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, in particular to law students, is that they learn a particular kind of thinking style, pessimistic kind of thinking style, where they learn to see things very negatively. They learn to break apart problems analytically. They're always looking for trouble. They're always looking for signs of danger, because that, in fact, is what they're going to do when they get out in the real world. They're going to be problem solving, oftentimes for people in deep, deep trouble. And those are very stressful circumstances. And their job as a lawyer is not only to be an advocate and adversarial, but to use this kind of cognitive thinking style to figure out problems. A lot of these people tend to be perfectionists. A lot of them tend to be stressful and anxious. And those kind of things, those qualities, all combined, they combine with maybe some genetic vulnerability, maybe some childhood bad experiences or trauma, and then you add on top of it this perpetual stress, this thinking style, and you really have the perfect storm for depression to develop.
Makes perfect sense. Now, Dan, like I mentioned earlier, we've been following your work for a while, and I'm always a big fan and supporter of folks who are willing to come out of the closet and talk about their experiences with mental illness. Now, tell us, what drove you to come out of the proverbial closet with your mental illness?
Really what happened is I got angry, and I got angry because I noticed people's reactions to my, at least in my immediate circle, to my depression, and I couldn't hide it anymore. And people had all kinds of reactions. A lot of them were very painful to me because I couldn't understand them. They'd say, "What's wrong with you?" or "Go on a vacation," or you're ungrateful. I mean, you got a great job and a great wife. And I thought, I was just so angry about that. And then I found out more about, the high statistics for lawyers, and I thought, somebody has to do something about this. So I felt compelled to do something. And then I decided to write this article for a national lawyers magazine called Trial Magazine, and I just jumped, and it felt like jumping off a cliff, but I did it.
So were you worried about losing clients when you wrote it?
Yeah, I mean, especially my 3 law partners at the time. I mean, they corralled me into an office and said, "What the hell are you doing? I mean, people are going to throw stones at you. Who's going to hire a mentally ill lawyer? Who's going you're going to damage our firm." All this kind of bad, fear and pestilence, fire's going to rain down from heaven. You're screwed. This was a stupid idea. And, it made me feel about an inch tall. because I didn't have any support at the time. I just knew in my heart that it was something right to do, and I had to do it. And, but in the beginning, it was very tough going, very, very, very tough. Sure. None of those things came to pass. All those things that they feared and were angry about, none of them came to pass.
Dan, I thought I read in a Wall Street Journal article that you actually acquired more clients after you came out with your mental illness.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I actually I think because so many people in America have a low opinion of lawyers. They see them as hucksters or arrogant, or they're just trying to shake people down for money. They almost see them as they're kind of caricatures of human beings, and a lot of that's the fault of lawyers. I mean, they're responsible for sending out those kind of messages, and I think that for whatever reason, people in the community saw me more as human. As a person. I'm not a cardboard cutout. I'm a real person with real problems. I'm not trying to hide it. And I think that a lot of people, what they're looking for, to be honest, I think not only someone who could win their case, but I think an authentic person who cares about them. And maybe they sensed that in me, or some clients definitely did. And I'd lost no clients. So I would hold my breath that something like that would happen, something dire, but it didn't.
Well, think about it statistically. If about 25% of the population is struggling with some form of mental illness and only one person in their life loves them, half the population can directly relate to what you went through. So that's half of your clients or potential clients can understand where you are.
That's true.
So before we move on to your documentary, when it comes to managing your own depression, earlier you talked about how you manage worry with a couple of processes. Do you have anything in addition to that you use to manage your own depression?
Well, I guess everybody's different, and I tell people, mindfulness meditation I see as kind of like not a religion or a spirituality. It's kind of like mental wellness. For me, I touched on meaning before, but I think I tell people if you have a spiritual practice, keep doing it. If you don't, maybe search for one, because I think, we have thousands of years of tradition of wisdom contained in these spiritual traditions, and that, we're starved. People are starved in this country for meaning, and it's something that they could access, and I think it could be another source of nourishing themselves mentally, physically, spiritually, and that is something I do regularly, and I'm not always a religious person. Sometimes I am, but I like to think of myself as more spiritual. And I remember Mother Teresa, was my hero, said, in the silence of the heart, God speaks. So for me, I think that means quiet time in nature is one of my favorite places to go and just be quiet. We're surrounded by noise, and I don't think it's good for us, or a lot of it isn't. And I think when we study this more, I think we'll find there's a powerful connection between all the noise in our culture, too much media, too much Facebook, too much Twitter, and mental illness.
That's great advice. If you're spiritually inclined, try and rely on that, lean on that to try and find some mental peace. I like it.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your documentary and maybe where we could listen to it or see it.
Sure. Well, about 4 years ago, this is kind of an outgrowth of, began with the website, and then I started a support group shortly thereafter for lawyers with depression, and which is still going strong. But then I started hearing from different lawyers and organizations about the country or law schools, how do we talk about this? We get it. We recognize it's a massive problem, but we don't have the resources to talk about it. We don't have lawyers in our community that are willing to stand up and say, guess what? I have depression. It ain't going to happen. So we don't know what to do. Okay, so I went to 3 foundations and got 3 grants to produce this documentary called A Terrible Melancholy. And this film features 4 lawyers, a judge, experts, and a Lincoln scholar who we interviewed in New York City. We flew to New York City, we flew to Seattle, and we interviewed people here in Buffalo. And it's 30 minutes long, and the point of it was to send it around the country and say to people who say, we don't know what to do or how to talk about it, here you go, plug it in. You don't even have to think about it. Mm-hmm. And in 30 minutes, we'll cover the whole topic. And it's got an original score. It's a lot of people participated in it. It's something I'm really, really proud of. And right now, we posted a couple of years ago, the film was about 2 or 3 years ago. We posted a 5-minute trailer, and just about a month ago, we posted the whole thing on YouTube. So you can watch the film there.
Great.
And also on my website.
So you can find it on Dan's website, lawyerswithdepression.com. We'll also have links to it in our show notes. So Dan, tell us a little bit about your coaching business.
Well, it began about 2 years ago because I kind of come to the conclusion, and it's something I'm always thinking about, what works for people, what really helps them overcome depression and anxiety, because they usually travel together. And what I found out, therapy is so important and medication is so important. But, say somebody sees a therapist once a week, that's 4 hours a month. They might see a psychiatrist once a month, maybe for a half hour, who prescribes them medicine if they see a psychiatrist at all. And that just isn't enough support for people going through such a tremendously painful disease, painful illness, painful time. So I tried to develop a coaching practice for those people where I would talk to them once a week for an hour, either in person or on phone, and I talk to people around the country, lawyers and non-lawyers, because the problems are similar when you're talking about depression. And I provide them like structured, practical solutions that we work on every week to move them out of depression and anxiety and towards a more sustained, healthier, manageable lifestyle. And I found this tremendously satisfying and meaningful, because in a way I feel it's taken something so awful, depression, just something so awful to go through, and to me it's kind of turned it around into something meaningful. So if I can be of help to other people, that's why I'm here, and that's why I created that practice.
Dan, how could our listeners contact you if they were interested in learning a little bit more about that?
There's a big link on my website, and it says Depression Coaching with Dan, and it explains the whole process and how we do it and my philosophy. And there's a questionnaire they can get to fill out to see if this is something that would work for them, and they could do that just by emailing me.
That's perfect, Dan. Now, I am convinced that finding your purpose in life can lay the foundation for conquering worry and managing any struggles that come your way. But experience has also taught me that 95% of people don't know what their purpose in life is. Now, Dan, you knew you were going to get this question in advance, but we're curious. Do you know what your purpose in life is?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's the work I'm doing right now. And I think that a lot of people I coach and people I know, if this isn't on there, this very question is where the rubber meets the road. And I think as people get older, what they do is they think about it a lot, but they don't do anything about it. And sometimes they don't do anything about it because they don't have anybody to talk with about it. And I think they also have a difficult time figuring out, how do I make that a concrete reality? And they can't seem to think of it in stages. So that's something I work on in my own life. I work on it, but it's something that I think people need to think about it in more concrete terms. Okay, what is it? What would it actually mean for me to leave my job and become a journalist. I often say lawyers have the most active fantasy lives of any professionals I know. Most of them will say, "Oh yeah, I close my door and I think about opening a pastry shop," or I want to be a clown in the circus. I mean, because they're deeply either unhappy or they may be very good at what they do, but it exacts a tremendous toll on them. So I think finding their purpose, a sense of direction. Carl Jung, the protege of Freud, once say, it's not so much that people don't know what they want to do, but they can't find the courage to do it. And, I think that's true in life. People already have a good sense of what they want to do or that they should do, but they can't seem to do it. And they often have people in their life surrounding them saying, don't do it, don't do it. So it becomes even harder to find the courage.
Dan, that is just great advice. We really appreciate you coming on the show today, sharing your experiences, and I hope when your book launches, you come back on the Conquer Worry Show.
Oh, it was a real privilege, Jay. Thanks so much for the invitation, and I'd be delighted to come back on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Conquer Worry Show. For additional resources, please visit us at conquerworry.org. We can also be found on social media. Connect with us on Twitter at twitter.com/conquerworry or on Facebook at facebook.com/conquerworry. And new episodes can be found on YouTube at youtube.com/conquerworryshow.